Kiran Rao, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. This is, of course, Mumbai Dialogues, and this is by the New Indian Express. My name is Sudhir Srinivasan, and I'm so happy to have you here. I absolutely enjoyed both films that you made. We will talk about the long duration between them, obviously. But we'll get into some of those spaces. We'll discuss the film, we'll discuss allied topics. Let this be as freewheeling as we let it be. Like I said, I absolutely loved your film, and I thought it was a really authentic story about real people, but told in a way that really captured the cinematic quality inherent in all our lives, which I thought was particularly profound and beautiful, which is why, of course, this session is titled The Real Story. These are the stories that people like me want to keep seeing in the big screen, specifically. So, we'll talk about your objectives as a filmmaker, about the film as well. First, let's get started off by asking you whether you think enough real stories are being told in Hindi cinema in the first place.
Ooh, tricky question, Sudhir. You started off with a googly. I do think now there's certainly so much more variety in what we're doing because our audience is sort of one step ahead of us. I'm the kind of person, as we were discussing earlier, I don't watch enough to know all the kinds of films really being made on a weekly basis. But I think there's an attempt far more to take risks, I feel, than was the case at one point when you only had, people singing and dancing on the tops of mountains, So I do think that there's a move in that direction. There's probably the push of OTT, there's the push of, being now open to an audience that you're basically competing to take them away from Korean cinema, Hollywood and everything else in between. So I do think there is more happening. Can there be more than that? Definitely.
When we discuss authentic stories, there is often the belief that they are somehow at loggerheads with the notion of popular entertainment. And that's always seemed very bizarre to me because this was Lapata Ladies, for example, was popular. It was absolutely entertaining. So I don't see why, when you say real stories, they need to be thought of as operating in like a parallel space entirely.
I think when we went away from theaters for a little while, thanks to COVID, and the return to cinema was sort of slower. I think what happened was people assumed that if you wanted people to come back to cinemas, you would have to give them explosions or going out into outer space or some massively glamorous sort of stories that they would only go to the cinema to watch, And I don't think that's ever the case when you're pulling people back. I think the idea that audiences are, they actually are flush with choice at this point. So they would come to the cinema, I think, for exactly what you're saying, which is something that they feel is authentic, something that they think is fresh. So I don't think, I think as filmmakers, our attempt should be that rather than we have to go for spectacle, we have to go for wowing the audience. It's like if you go for something honest, something quite interesting and happens to be well within the realm of real, in fact, highly unglamorous and village story, which you'd ordinarily not think that people will be, want to go to a multiplex to watch. You'd be surprised because people are interested. They want to be surprised. They want to be taken on a journey that is unexpected. Doesn't matter if it's down a village lane and not, into Mars or something.
Doesn't matter that the explosions are emotional in nature and not necessarily the actual bombs going out there.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a bit of resistance from a group of people who are used to, sort of seeing films as a medium of escape. As seeing them as seeing stories as fantasy entertainment, so to speak. How would you cater the sort of films that you believe in making to this group that's been so trained to consume such cinema from when they were?
So for two parts to this. I mean, one part is that I feel like our audience is very, very varied. There's a hugely there's a vast diversity in the appetites of our audience, and that itself leaves room for us to try all kinds of different cinema and attract them in different ways. And you will find someone interested, say, even if you have a very, very dark or a very, very fluffy entertainer, you'll have your audience for all these different kinds of things.
So you're not really thinking about how to make it appealing for everyone out there.
Everyone, exactly. I feel like you have to be honest to your material, and you'll find the audience that resonates with that material, to my mind. But secondly, when I was in the second part of it, is that I always wanted to be part of the arts, but somehow at the back of my head, I felt like I wanted to do, I'd studied economics, I wanted to do development work, and arts won out. I wanted to study film. And I realized that, the arts, of which cinema is one, is able to be that mirror in some way for the audience in a way. It's a mirror, but it can also be that little window that you open up. It can be a door through which you escape, And I think that is where the excitement for me lies. I mean, I feel sometimes you will pass by a mirror, you'll see something perhaps that, as a society we should acknowledge or have a conversation about. Sometimes it's a little window of perspective that you'd open up to something that ordinarily, you'd pass over because you want to just make it fun and games and entertaining. And sometimes it's a door through which, you take a flight of fantasy, but actually that fantasy is telling you something very real that's happening in the world. So it's an allegory of some kind, a metaphor for something that's happening,
Isn't that why everybody is so drawn to cinema, so drawn to storytelling, right? Because you never know when the next profound change is going to come to your life from out of an experience you didn't anticipate at all.
And I feel cinema, we place a lot of emphasis on films, or like we place a lot of expectation on films in some way changing society, or people come to me particularly since this film asking about messaging and how films can be a vehicle for change. And I don't think films necessarily should be burdened with that. I do think that it's I think meritorious enough if a film is able to adequately represent the society we are living in, and then show us a little bit of a mirror of the kind of people we are, or the kind of problems we face, and the choices that we make, and potentially the choices we could make.
Just some time back, we were talking about how the Insta Reels generation, the constant dopamine hits everybody gets, prevents you from feeling anything deeply, or in a sustained manner anyway. So it seems to me that if a film is able to engage you emotionally, continuously for 2 hours, that in itself is a job really well done.
I mean, literally between a 90-minute film and a 120-minute film, people will decide whether they want to watch it. I mean, I'm saying 5-7 years ago, we never looked at runtime before going in to watch a film. But even that now, a 2-hour commitment is asking a lot of an audience. And I'm really grateful that my film ran for as long as it did. It's testament to how much people liked it. Because it was a 2-hour long film, which for some people is 30 minutes longer
No, I know what you're saying. I mean, these days you can hear a loud sigh going on in theaters when people look at the certificate and they're like, 145 minutes. You did want a film. What do you... Oh, that's you.
No, sometimes.
What kind of films do you enjoy? I ask you this because several of us sort of enjoy and crave star vehicles as a, from childhood until we wisen up, obviously. Did that ever happen for you? What sort of films were you gravitating towards?
I didn't have much choice growing up. I grew up pre-internet, pretty much everything. I grew up in the Doordarshan era, and we went to the Saturday club for a Friday evening movie. We didn't have much choice really. So I grew up on the great era of NFDC, let's say, when we had lovely films being produced by the Indian new wave directors. I grew up on Ray and Ghatak and Rishikesh Mukherjee and all the greats really, Sholay and the rest of it. But, by the time we got to college, there was sort of this film school snobbery of watching, Italian New Wave and French, Italian neorealist,
So
French
you
New
went through
Wave.
that phase.
Yeah, went through the Japanese and Iranian and all those kinds of cinema. I have to say the guilty pleasure now is Korean K-dramas. I don't know how many people here are even sort of exposed to
No,
the
but I know out,
joys of
out
watching
there,
Korean.
I know there's a substantial
Any
audience
hands
for it.
up, anyone who does watch. Oh wow, great. Yeah, amazing. You know,
And I like how all of that is college going
yeah,
audience.
yeah. And
I'm nowhere a college going. I went to college long ago.
Yeah.
But I do watch.
yeah, and it's actually quite fascinating because there's a huge variety in the Korean television, like serialized fiction space. There's the kind of police procedurals. There are the hospital dramas. There's of course the dark, sort of murder mysteries. All the rest of it. But it's fascinating how they've managed to grab the entire world and because without losing something very specific to their own culture. It's not like they've sort of flattened the curve and made it, McDonaldized the whole way they do things. They make things for their own audience, but now the world is watching. So it's something really to learn from, I think, as people who are making things for the world.
You've made 2 films so far, separated by 13 years. What's going on?
I think many things. I think I've been working relentlessly, honestly, on my own writing, on producing, and I think the big gap is primarily because I never found perhaps the right writing partner for some of my work, but also the right headspace. So it was a combination of both. I think being a mom, a young mother, enjoying raising my son a lot, fulfilled me creatively a lot and didn't, sort of therefore make me perhaps have the drive and creative frustration enough to say, it doesn't matter, I'm making the next thing I write, So I've lived with these projects for a while and never found them ready to actually put on the floors. So much so that when in 2011 my film came out, and 2018 Amir told me about this story which he came across when he was on the jury of a screenwriting competition, and he said it's called Two Brides, and he told me a one-liner, and when I heard it, I felt like this was a perfect kind of vehicle because I was free in some way to develop it the way I wanted, and somebody had already done a bunch of the hard work of writing the story. So it allowed me, it was like open with all the potential of this journey movie of two girls. So yeah, I've been on that film for 6 years almost. So I guess out of that 13 years, you can minus 6.
Got it. I mean, even though there's a significant difference in time between both films, both are united in how you're not really interested in selling the usual notions of a hero. For instance, I mean, you're choosing instead to focus on the extraordinary in people you would otherwise think of as ordinary. So do you want to talk to us about that facet, about tapping into the fleeting heroes that people can be in certain moments?
So nicely put. That's actually exactly what I'd like to do. I mean, and I think I'd find myself drawn towards. I feel, I guess because I never grew up on films where you had the huge heroes, sort of winning the day, having these big action sequences, etc. I always gravitated towards smaller stories, and I suppose in my head, it always, for all of us, we are the heroes of our own lives. And I felt that there's something very extraordinary about each of our lives, honestly, even in the small little struggles in the everyday of our lives. I think there's something very beautiful about it. And honestly, that's what I really want to tap into, because there's enough of the caped warriors out there, but the everyday stories of your mums who are struggling to get you to go to school while also trying to earn the living for the family, or your brother who's not able to get a job, those are stories that somehow speak to me a lot more I don't know, profoundly
No, I know what
intimately,
you're saying,
you know?
because even as a viewer, the Caped Warrior tells me that, well, he's very different from me. He makes me feel like, okay, I wish I could be him. But these stories tell me that, hey, that is you. You know, it can be you in a very practical, um, possible way.
Yeah, and I feel drawn to that. I mean, because life really is. I guess I'm deeply interested in what makes us human. Honestly, it's I suppose part of my artistic journey to understand, our frailties, our struggles, and our very small triumphs, which might seem small for other people, but are really huge in our lives. And those moments deeply interest me.
And those aspects really come out in Lapata, for example, especially during the railway station portions, with Manju and all of those other people banding together to rescue this Kumari, right? So, where did you gain access to that world? How far removed was that world from the life that you had led?
Honestly, a lot of people think, I mean, I have to say, highly privileged, grown up in a city, gone to the very best of schools and colleges and things like that. So people assume that I wouldn't actually have had many of the experiences, perhaps, of, say, many of the characters in the film, or in rural India, perhaps, particularly. Like, people often ask, how did you, being an urban person, how did you sort of authentically represent the village? But I feel there's a sort of universal humanity in all these characters, and it's exceedingly easy. It was very easy for me to kind of feel the heart of each of them, and therefore, sort of build them as nuanced characters rather than a village girl. They just weren't a village woman, or or just a corrupt cop for me. They became very well-rounded individuals, and that's what somehow
And they just happen to be there.
they happen to. And honestly, I grew up my entire childhood in Calcutta. My family is from the south, so we were very much part of those people in that train passing by behind Phul Kumari and Manju Mai. I was in that train in 2001 going back to Bangalore to my family. For years from Calcutta, we would take, the Coromandel Express to Madras, and then the, Brindavan to Bangalore. And more often than not, we've had the experience of sleeping in the second class compartment, sleeping with our hold alls, they were called, our bedding between the seats. So I grew up extremely middle class. I actually continue to live my life incredibly simply. And so, that station was not at all unusual for me. I've been on those stations. I've eaten off those stations. I still, if it was easy enough, would continue to take those trains. So I guess, personal experience aside, what I felt connected me to them is the fact that, like I said, these were interesting people. They were just interesting humans for me to create and sort of fashion,
And it's a film where women save women. And thank God for that. Do you want to talk to us about when a woman or some women saved you in some form or manner in your life?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Well, I've been to an all-girls school. I went to convent. I went to an all-girls college. So I guess I was saved by women on a daily basis. We had incredible teachers. I had wonderful captains sometimes that I looked up to. I can't think of anyone specific, but I do know that I was very lucky in some ways to be given the opportunities that I have been to have the kind of access to education, to exposure to people that I had all along. I mean, I can't think of any one woman who saved me, perhaps, but all along there were shoulders that I could climb on. Honestly, I've felt it. I mean, maybe I'm just a lucky person to have that, but I do feel like if you look for it, you will find those shoulders, and that's why I was so keen that this film encourage girls to go out there, encourage women to take those chances, because more often than not, whether it's another woman to save you or a man, there'll be that helping hand if you look for it. I genuinely believe it.
And for Phul Kumari, for example, it's not just one woman.
Exactly.
It's
There's
a bunch of people out
bunch
there.
of people, and at the outset, you wouldn't imagine that those people would be the kind to help her out. You know,
Yeah, and
the
because-
first impression would be that they are.
And because they've been
thieves.
portrayed in a certain way in cinema, you look at them and you sort of you sort of already start worrying about her safety on some level.
Yeah. And which is why that scene, I've always really enjoyed that scene where, you know, where Abdul begins to walk and Chotu tells her, जो दिखता है वैसा होता नहीं है, वो जो होता है वैसा दिखता नहीं है, which honestly I really feel very strongly. You know, today we're so quick to judge, we're so, like you said, no, you want to know in a second, is this good or bad? Give me the result, you know, and the perusing, the slow kind of, you know, being able to let things distill, letting a person slowly get to you is also something that we've kind of lost over time.
I mean, we were talking about the railway station, Manju sort of helping her out. And from, I mean, it seems like for a while, Manju is very frustrated that she can't wake this woman up from being held hostage by the system that is patriarchy. How do you make somebody see sense in those spaces when you can see that they are held hostage, but they themselves seem rather happy to exist in that system? Is it even the business of another woman to rescue her, or I mean, how do you see that complex dynamic?
I see it, I mean, honestly, I feel like we have to be not very quick to judge women's decisions. The decisions that women take at various points in their lives are usually informed by a lot of complexity that they have either sort of been conditioned into or are actually dealing with, because they've, you know, there's many things to consider. So it's very easy to judge, why doesn't she do this, or why doesn't she get up and leave, etc., etc.
You know, you speak about how there's a small change that occurs in Fool. From expecting nothing, she begins to expect some acknowledgement, some respect towards the end of the film. And this notion of growth itself seems very different for the many women in the film. You know, for one, it may be just getting up and leaving the entire environment. For another, it's existing in that environment, but hey, once in a while, do you want to look at me and say I cooked well? Or do you want to maybe cook something I like to eat? You know, I found that nuance very interesting, and with respect to Fool and Jaya, who are both so diametrically opposite in terms of what they seek in life. Personally, what does Kiran Rao see as relatable aspects in those two opposite, well, very different characters, let's put it that way?
Yeah, I see, oddly enough, I see a lot of both of them in myself. I mean, obviously Jaya more immediately comes to mind because I was equally driven. I wanted to study, I wanted to make something of my life, and I was very fortunate that I had a family that expected nothing less. In fact, I was sent off from home by my dad saying, you know, all we ask is that you're economically independent, whatever you choose to do, because I was going off to do film. And they're like, we have no idea how you're going to make a living. We don't know how it works. But that was the only expectation, that I would be able to take care of myself. So the drive and the, you know, the excitement about this journey of what you can do with your education, from Jaya, I feel very, feel that kinship. But with the Pool, I similarly feel a kinship, because I think, I mean, at least women of my generation, and I'm not so sure, you know, say a new, whatever, millennial generation, whether they're any different. But at a certain point, you know, you feel very much that there is in some way, an expectation to settle down, to perhaps have children, have a family, you know, have some sort of companionship. And I realize that it's something that's both probably conditioning as well as genetically conditioned in some way, where you feel like, oh, okay. And I think that that's also something you have been conditioned to think about, is like your clock is ticking, the clock, you know, it's that kind of desire for stability, I think, is also something that I felt at a certain point in my life, and I can understand why Pool would want that. There's the idea that family will in some way complete your, sort of personal life.
which for me is what made Lapata so beautiful, because it's not necessarily saying this is the only way out, or this is the real solution. I'm making a film about these women and they're oppressed by patriarchy, but I'm not necessarily saying that all of you should just exist this system, or keep fighting every day. Yeah.
I think, well, the world is now so complex, and there's so many options, honestly, for young women today, which is so amazing. I still think that we are in some way coded to be a very social animal, to live within certain pack structures. As nuclear as we might become, we'd like the idea of community of some kind. And I feel for modern day people, especially for modern day women, our families are our friends now. And I hugely sort of depend on my circle of friends for all the things that perhaps a certain generation depended on their cousins and their families and their parents for. So yeah, as we've evolved, I feel, different kinds of women will find their support groups. And I think what's most important is knowing that it's out there for you, and we must as society build it, especially as men and women of privilege coming from, backgrounds where we've have the access to create those support systems for other women. And
even if it's
girls.
not a case of saying I don't need anyone, you're saying, well, don't be burdened by having to find friends only in this group. The world is far too vast.
And of course, now with social media, you are never alone, and you're always alone, always having FOMO. But yeah,
I think that topic could get us talking for a couple of hours, I think. You were talking, because we are now talking about the system that is patriarchy so much. In this film, you make several interesting choices, like the corrupt cop gets sufficiently humanized towards the end, for example, which you didn't necessarily need to do, but you still do that. He gets this redemptive moment towards the end, and it's almost a stand up and clap for him sort of moment as well. Do you want to talk to me about whether you see even men like him as being a product of the system, as being victims of the system on some level?
absolutely, he's a product / victim of the system. I think we all know people like him, and people like him have in some way kept the system going, and we are accustomed to that way of functioning of our many systems. But I think within that, to find the space for humanity, for that grayness, where a person whom you're expecting nothing less than corruption and a lack of empathy towards this character, even within that character, it's not completely unnatural that he should do this as well. So for us, it was important that it stay exceedingly believable, that a person who's so accustomed to taking so we wanted, actually visually also, he's constantly eating. He's this kind of guy who's either physically eating or collecting notes and eating away somebody's bribe, that even someone like him, it should not seem completely unnatural, and he's suddenly turned over a new leaf and become a savior of this girl. But that there are shades to the people that you least expect is what we wanted to go for.
And it really came through as being very believable, because you can see that this is where he draws the line. But this doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to accept bribes anymore.
And not going to take that stuff that she leaves on the table, So that was, while writing it also was one of the trickier things for us to write in, because the flip had to feel real. And the option was to keep him, not particularly dislikable, and therefore it believable, or to do it the way we did, which is that you don't expect him to do it, but it's still, when he does it, it doesn't feel like it's like, what? Why,
why was it, how important was it for you to make this film come across as a comedy? Could you have pulled it off without the humor in it? Treating the subject as a very serious subject of two women who are oppressed, who find their redemption in different ways, but not necessarily it being a comedy.
We could have, of course. The original story was written in a more sort of realistic art house vein. And I sort of saw the humor in it from the get go. I mean, just the swap itself was so just ripe to be, you know, milked for the humor in it. The satire of something like that happening, you know. And I kind of feel that humor is a great vehicle. It's a great device to actually open up conversations that are quite uncomfortable otherwise. You know, whether you've seen it in stand-up and you've seen it in the best of comedy, which is that subjects that are otherwise taboo or subjects that quite often are very polarizing in their, you know, in what they're talking about, can through humor be diffused. That tension is diffused and it allows people to talk about these things without being combative or being unpleasant about it. And I think when you're laughing at each other or at yourself, you are at your most open in some ways. And I think that's what I really wanted. You know, you're kind of vulnerable, you're open, you leave yourself sort of room to you know, to maybe reach out and shake hands across that line. You know, that's why I felt humor would be the best choice in this case.
And this journey that you embarked on, where you're not really succumbing to the rules and notions of how storytelling must be to cater to the big maximum out there, what are the rewards of it? What are the joys of it? We know the struggles of it.
Well, the rewards are the love that you get when you actually manage to reach the kind of audience that I have and get the appreciation of the audience that you have. That there's no better love, honestly. I feel that this film has done for me unexpectedly well in terms of how people have been moved by it and by the number of people from very, very different backgrounds who come up and tell me what they liked about it, how they enjoyed sharing it with their families or their friends. I think there's no, I don't know, probably the only greater thing would be to, you know, sort of get 10,000 crores at the box office or win an Academy Award, but I've pretty much come as close as I can to that. I love what this film has done. So I think that's the big joy. It's rare, honestly. I don't know if I'll be able to do it time and again. I certainly hope to, but I also realized that, look, I studied mass communication and I want to speak to a wider audience. Honestly, the idea was to not just make films, but make films that open up spaces for dialogue and, you know, for reflection. So I'm hoping that, like, with different genres, with different kinds of films, I'll be able to kind of do that, you know, have more
And not
dialogue with the audience.
And definitely not be seen as existing away from the popular content.
Yeah. And I think I don't want to say what I won't do or what I will do because I don't know, and I think that's the wonderful thing. It's a journey for me to also understand my own voice, really, and what I can do. And different things interest me and drive me at different points, you know. So so I won't say that I won't do a film perhaps that is more maybe realistic or dark or, you know, quite unlike this film. But I think the attempt will always be to engage an audience, to have you know, some sort of conversation with people going into the cinema where you know, in some way you've made a connection with the people watching.
Are you going to keep us waiting another 13 years?
I certainly hope not. I'm working very hard not to, but no, Hopefully not.
Tell me this, after the advent of OTT platforms, there's been a tendency to slot certain films as being appropriate for OTT and some other films as being appropriate for theaters. Do you agree with the general assessment of this? Because I'm sure that the minds that are would definitely slot like a Lapata as being like a film for the OTT platforms, right? How do you see this? Do you agree?
You know, I think it's a practical viewpoint given that we have so few cinemas in this country compared to the number of films that we make. 10,000 films, 10,000 screens is just really not enough for every film to be put in cinemas. So I don't think that it's unwarranted to think like that when you're a distributor. But and some films perhaps have in their the kind of story that they kind of touching upon need to are perhaps more niche or more sort of difficult, more touchy, more sensitive, and therefore easier to put on OTT directly. But I think we need to work on the distribution exhibition aspect of our industry so that it doesn't become this binary, and it's easier for films to make it to cinemas, because I think every filmmaker wants their films to go to cinemas. I think a lot of people who have stopped going to cinemas, if it becomes easier to watch films more accessible and more economical, I think a lot more people would go to cinemas as
And
well.
at least personally speaking, I want to watch all the good films in the biggest screen possible.
Exactly.
Right?
And why not? Like, when we were in college, even in college, we could afford to go to a film, occasionally buy a samosa and watch a film, and it wouldn't, set you back so much that you'd never watch a film for the rest of the year. But we need to make it that easy, I feel. But I think that practical consideration will always be there, about because of the cost of marketing, the cost of, sort of P&A on the film, and the slotting and weekend that you'll get depending on the year and planning. So I suppose it's just practical.
It's been constantly suggested for a few years now that Hindi cinema seems bereft of ideas. Now, with all the re-releases that are happening, that question seems to be getting drummed in even further. Is that the issue? Or, I see a film like Lapata and I'm like, okay, so there are these great ideas. Are we just looking in the right place?
Well, there are waves, there are moments. I don't think that one can be so quick to judge, honestly. It's also, been a big churn because of COVID, and post the lockdown, the industry contracted. I mean, the size of our industry contracted so much that just coming back to normal meant a lot of scrambling, reassessment, sort of, and kind of understanding of what audiences were watching again. So I do think that it's perhaps a phase, and I do think we'll arrive again at a place where our audiences are excited about what we're making. We're seeing that a lot more people are interested in horror, and we've seen what a huge sort of bunch of successes horror and action has in the cinema. And it's really like in that sense, you've had pretty huge hits in the past year that are quite different and are quite original as well. When you think about Stree 2 or even Munjia or Shaitan, and going backwards, Crew was a huge hit. All of these are original films and very, very different from each other. 12th Fail. So I don't think that we are as, sort of bankrupt when in the ideas department yet. I don't think anyone should write off the Hindi film industry at all. I think there are phases, and I think it's also difficult at this point because our audience is really the world. It's not just we maybe also got complacent, but now there's so much stuff out there that you really have to up your game if you want to compete for their attention.
As we are nearing the end of this conversation, before I open it up for the audience to ask you a couple of questions, did you ever consider roping in more mainstream faces? Because you speak about making this film as accessible to people as possible. And was this one of the strategies that occurred to you? Because I'm sure getting them wouldn't be a problem for you.
No, it did. Well, honestly, I didn't want to because I just wanted this film to feel authentic. The story is so rooted, so organic that it did just felt like it would lose all of that if we went to someone so well known that you knew that it was this big actor playing these girls. So it did. I mean, it didn't. We knew that there was a couple of roles in which we could get big stars, and that was the role of Manjumai and Manohar. But the rest, actually, Amir was equally, on board for us to not have stars in the mix. I think he also knew that what would really work for the film is that it's so authentic. Like it feels absolutely real, and you're almost surprised by the freshness of the cast.
Yeah, and you're never thinking about the actors because you're thinking only about the characters.
Yeah, that I mean that was our goal, and you're right. The downside of that is that you lose I suppose, the ease of marketing a big star. So the marketing is always the uphill when you're doing. Working with newcomers, but it's also very rewarding because audiences respond first to that. When like everywhere I've gone, the first question is the casting. The casting is so unusual. How did you find these people? Where were they all this time? So it's very rewarding to know that was what we were going for also.
One of the biggest joys of the film was its final stretch, I think. There's a wonderful emotional flourish to the whole film as it ends. Keeps hitting near perfect notes there. Also leaves the story rather open because it leaves you wondering what could happen the next year. Would Jaya return? Would Phul Kumari go back to the railway station? Would she take her husband along to visit them? There are all these questions in the air. I ask you this because are you thinking of a sequel for this film?
I have been asked this in the past. Well, if someone writes a good enough sequel, of course, I'd love to make another part 2 because I'd also love to know what she does with her agricultural degree in agriculture, and
But you're not necessarily commissioning it yet.
not yet. I think I need to sort of spread my wings and explore other areas for a little while. But these women made a place in my heart, and I would love to know what they're doing next.
Meanwhile, I read that the film is spreading its wings. Apparently, it's getting released in Japan.
Yes, we're delighted that the film is getting a Japanese release. In theatrical release at that. So it's so exciting. Shochiku, which is a Japanese distribution studio, acquired the film and is releasing it. I think it releases on the 4th of October. Very exciting because I did interviews with Japanese media on Zoom, and it was wonderful to see how much they connected with the soul of the film. I mean, of course, they had the questions, cultural questions a little bit, but the studio had done a lot to kind of contextualize it and give them history in terms of like what Indian customs are, maybe in a village, what would happen, etc. But very, very interesting questions, and I felt they very much sort of identified with some of those problems that women go through, and I very much enjoyed my.
And it tells you, doesn't it? I mean, if you really go inward and you start focusing on the stories here, then you can never tell who it can touch.
It's fairly actually universal, which is why I really felt like it doesn't matter that this story is actually in a village. It's quite similar to what many women might be facing in cities or across the world even. So that is the case is very humbling for me. It's great to know.
Kiran, I would like to spend another hour at least discussing the many nuances of this film, but I'm afraid we are nearing the end of this conversation. Now might be a good time to open the session up for the audience to ask some questions. We'll take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. Absolutely fantastic insights. You have answered my question already in bits and pieces. Yet,
You're welcome.
any business, goes through research before investing money, and I am sure that cinema making is also business. So, while selecting a script, what kind of research you do? Like I'm a digester, I'm sure that everybody in the room would have read Digest at some point in time. true life stories which ends with a positive ending definitely is a sure shot success.
Right.
So I'm sure that you must be doing some historicals, trends before you give a brief to a scriptwriter and then you select. What are the
Well, sir, actually, the
metrics?
interesting thing is filmmaking is such a heady combination of art and commerce. It's very hard to value an idea, except to know that this is a story that you feel will appeal to a lot of people. And when it's I think the best judge of that is when you actually hear a story, whether when someone tells you a story, your reaction and your interest in it will actually mirror 99% of humanity, because we are all very similarly built, I feel. So I think when Amir first told me the story, he told it to me in one line when he says, two brides are going in Ghungat. They've just young girls, they've just got married. Shadi ka season hai, they're going in a train, and this guy goes from bus to train, ye wo leke wo ladki ko ghar le jata hai, and when he lifts up the ghungat, it's someone else. I was like, what? And actually that's a reaction everybody would have had. It doesn't matter which background you're from. And I think that when you kind of land a story that has that sort of universal hook,
Wow.
is that could
This will work.
actually it will work. So it is a punt on some level, and then starting from that, it takes sometimes 5 years, 6 years, 4 years, 10 years to make a film, and it can undergo all kinds of changes, and the business of it changes. You have COVID coming in the middle, the whole industry changes, all kinds of things. But within that, if you work to secure your budget to be within a certain recoupable figure, knowing that you're going with, say, newcomers and your whatever, it's a village story, and right now only action thrillers are working. If you work in a pragmatic way like that, then you can kind of cover the business aspect as well.
I also agree, because he also said that access and convenience is something which has facilitated options, And today I can sample things which I wouldn't have otherwise. When it was only big screen and you have to go out, spend money and all of that.
Yeah.
I guess that's the reason the canvas is increasing. So I got my answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Namaskara, Kiran Rao. I hope you remember your Kannada well. Nanu, I want to ask two questions. Real life and real life. Which one inspires which one? Which one copies which one? And which one influences the other?
Okay.
And the second question is, you people did discuss between theater audience and private home audience. Which one do you opt for? Any day. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we draw a lot from real life, whether we like it or not. All art is almost entirely based on observation, on experience, on dreaming, on imagination, all things that we actually in some way process from real life. It's even if it's the most imaginative thing, whether it's something set in outer space, it's taken off at some point from something that you've either experienced, something that you're excited about, something that you're inspired by, that you've read. So I think in real life, we are definitely inspired by real life. And I'm hoping that, and we have seen how real life has been inspired by or influenced by real life as well. So I think it is a bit of a chicken and egg. In terms of home versus the theatrical experience, I'm a bit old school like that. I think coming together in a darkened room, experiencing something, laughing together, crying together, changes us as human beings. I feel it's a completely different experience, and it is something that makes us human. It goes back to the time when we all sat around a fire, and somebody who had the best stories to tell would command the room and tell you about that, that big woolly mammoth that came around the corner. You know, it takes you that those flights of fantasy experienced together change us and in some way bond us as human beings. And I hate the fact that we've lost it to the extent that we have. I love the idea that there is the convenience of OTT. While I say this, I myself go less and less to cinemas because it's less convenient, less feasible to just keep going every weekend. And maybe I don't get what I want to watch in the screen, but I will to my dying day defend theaters and theatrical experiences, and I do not think we should lose them because they I feel are like the youngest art form and the one that needs the most nurture, most.
Cheers to that. Keep saying that, though.
My Chikama and me and our family were sitting, she watched a villain coming and attacking the heroine, the Kanda. Hey, on Bhattaya, no, So
Yes.
she was very panicky, that villain is hitting you, why don't you get out?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that involvement in the theater was more
Is amazing. The triumph when you know Bhuvan hits that six, together you cheer for India, you know, you're together you triumph over some filmy Ravan, you know.
And it's very strange, isn't it? Because you'd think that you'd be at your most vulnerable in a private, contained setup in the comforts of your home. But turns out you're far more vulnerable among a lot of people.
Absolutely. And it's cathartic. When you see a good film in a cinema, or it's like watching theater together when you go to a play. You can't watch a play when in a audience one is to one, right? It's not possible. It's the experience of you're connected in some odd way emotionally.
There's a
to
willing
everyone.
collective submission.
It's
on
a
some
collective submission, absolutely. So, yeah.
level. Suddenly I see a lot of hands. Okay.
First of all, congratulations on making such a wonderful film. You're one of the most successful filmmakers and a brilliant one, storyteller as well. I've got a question on the shift which is happening of late. Like Bollywood is an iconic industry, multi-million dollar. But of late what we are seeing, there's a shift to the regional cinemas, primarily the Malayalam films, Tamil films, Kannada films. We don't understand the language, but OTT is taking us there. We'll go by the subtitles. We enjoy consuming those kind of content. Why we have so few original content or original stories in Bollywood than what we find in South? Is it easy access to finance there? They look for smaller budgets because at the end of the day, you have to make a product which is profitable. If it's not profitable, it's not sustainable. Are they having more brilliant ideas than Bollywood? Or Bollywood stick to a set pattern formulas of success formulas. Something works, you keep on repeating till it runs out, like in the markets that we see. Right. So as a person who's very successful storyteller, you know the business of it, because at the end of the day, it's a business. How do you, why do you think the shift is happening?
You know, to begin with, I mean, we talked about this a bit earlier. I feel it's not, well, it's perhaps people can call it a shift, but I feel it's an expansion of our palettes. I'm actually really happy about this. I don't feel we should look at it as a loss for Bollywood. I feel we should look at it as a, the choice and the kind of advantage we have living in a country where we have so many healthy industries. It's fantastic. We can watch films in Tamil, Malayalam, Hindi, Telugu, and now we finally reached that place. I mean, all these industries have been making films for 50, 60 years, but I never knew where to watch them. I couldn't get my hands on them. And, you know, they would go to Cannes and they would go to all these places, but we as Indians never would get access to the best films of the South, let's say. So I feel like it's now expanded rather than shifted. And I think that's more the perspective we should look at it from. And sure, like I said earlier, there is now deep soul searching by people thinking about how we can up our game. You're right. perhaps it's the question of a smaller industry, budgets being a certain way, that the structuring of the industry being different and therefore more viable. Perhaps they just, people go through waves. Iranian cinema had a wave. There are waves of all kinds, and suddenly you'll have talent that's emerged from different areas, and I'm really excited about it. I don't feel like, I mean, in fact, it's not just to defend the Hindi film industry, but I feel like, great, we've entertained the country for many, many decades, and it's time for us to watch films from everywhere. It's wonderful, and it gives us, it's a time for us to also, bring our best to the table, because the audience today will assess its options and, kind of choose. So, like I said earlier, I think this past year we've had quite a few interesting hits and films that have come out of the Hindi film industry. So let's not be quick to say that the Hindi film industry, people have completely lost interest. Sure, maybe we were complacent. Maybe there was the idea of like sort of repeating the same storylines or relying on the same tropes to kind of catch eyeballs. But I don't think, I think most filmmakers have realized that you can't. You'll
Probably
have to
not
be
as much,
inventive and imaginative and be as good as the next best in any language.
Probably not as much a tragedy, right? Because as Bong Joon-ho said, look past the 1-inch barrier of subtitles and you'll get access to so many great films. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, but I see one or two hopeful faces. Do we? No, it's not my fault. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kiran, for this lovely conversation.